Hello everyone, welcome to Deep Sight. In the last video, we introduced the history of the Hundred Years' War between England and France. The history of the late Middle Ages in Europe has always been a variety of struggles around royal power, especially the most important countries. When France finally won the Hundred Years' War, Britain fell into a civil war that lasted for many years. This was the War of the Roses in England from the mid-15th century to the early 16th century. This was a long, complex, and cruel war, full of conspiracy, power struggle, bloody killing, and fratricide. It not only changed the historical trajectory of England, but also laid the foundation for the rise of the Tudor dynasty in the future. Next, we will describe in detail the cause, process, and profound impact of this war on Britain later. Let's unveil this bloody and full political history. Let's talk about the first article today, the tangled royal family. Like the Hundred Years' War, the Civil War in Britain also originated from the struggle for royal power. To understand the complex background of the War of the Roses, we must start with Edward III's family and children. Edward's descendants played an important role in the history of medieval England, especially in the Hundred Years' War between England and France, which he initiated. His children were the most relied upon political force in his regime. With their rise, their family not only had a profound influence in politics and military affairs, but their descendants also occupied an important position in the succession to the throne and power struggle in England. Behind every famous monarch, there is a powerful queen. Edward's wife, Queen Philippa, whose full name was Philippa of Hainaut, was born on June 24, 1310 and died on August 15, 1369. Like Edward's mother Isabella of France, she was the daughter of William I, Count of Hainaut, and Jean of Valois, born in Valenciennes. Her family background and her marriage alliance strengthened the ties between England and France, especially during the Hundred Years' War. Queen Philippa's French ancestry was of great significance to the political and diplomatic relations of the time. Philippa married Edward III at York Minster on January 24, 1328. At that time, Edward III had been on the throne for 11 months, but his mother Queen Isabella was unwilling to give up power, so Philippa did not hold the queen's coronation ceremony until 2 years later. Although it was a political marriage, fortunately, Queen Philippa and Edward III had a very harmonious marriage. The two had 13 children, 8 of whom lived to adulthood, 5 sons and 3 daughters. Queen Philippa was known for her mercy and kindness, especially after the victory of the Battle of Crécy in 1347. She persuaded Edward III to pardon the lives of the residents of Calais. The death of Queen Philippa was a huge blow to Edward III, and he was buried next to her 8 years after her death. The descendants educated by such parents can be said to be outstanding, and Edward III's sons were not mediocre. Edward's eldest son was the famous Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince. He was born in 1330 and died in 1376. His full name was Edward Woodstock. He was Edward's most beloved and relied on son, and the Crown Prince of England. He started to participate in military operations at a very young age. At the age of 16, he served as a commander in the Battle of Crécy and helped his father Edward III win the victory. He is a famous military leader in English history, famous for his brilliant record in the Hundred Years' War. In the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the 26-year-old not only led the British army to a decisive victory again, but also captured King John II of France in one fell swoop and brought him back to England. This military achievement was the most brilliant record in the Hundred Years' War between England and France and laid a decisive foundation for Britain's early advantage. The story of King John II of France is also a strange experience in history. While he was imprisoned in London, his eldest son Charles was regent and suppressed the rebellion in France. In order to release John II, Britain and France signed the Treaty of Bretagne, and the king became the biggest hostage for extortion. France was forced to cede a large amount of territory and pay a huge ransom. In order to raise the ransom, John II left his son Louis of Anjou as a hostage and returned to France. After returning to the kingdom, he minted francs to stabilize the currency and sent free mercenaries to participate in the Crusades. When his unfilial son Louis of Anjou escaped from English imprisonment without permission, John II volunteered to return to England to accept imprisonment out of chivalry. He brought a brief peace between the two countries with himself and died in London in 1364. Although Edward the Black Prince may be regarded as a hero and outstanding military commander in British history, he is remembered as a dark and terrifying figure in French memory. Edward's nickname, Le Terrible Prince Noir, originated from the French description of him as extremely cold and brutal on the battlefield. His tactics, including scorched earth invasion, chevauchée, of enemy territory, that is, rapid attacks, looting and burning of enemy villages and towns, and massacres of local people to deter resistance, were considered extremely cruel at the time. This strategy not only weakened the enemy's military strength and supply points, but also inspired French patriotism and national identity. The Black Prince married Joan of Kent and had a son, who later became Richard II. Perhaps because he fought too many battles in his youth and overdrew too much of his life, he always had health problems. Edward's activities in his later years were mainly focused on managing his territory in France, especially the Aquitaine region. From 1362 to 1372, he served as the ruler of Aquitaine. During this time, he indulged his army in lawlessness in Aquitaine, which damaged his reputation. This indulgence actually came from the medieval management model of the army. Robbery and plundering wealth were the main motivation for many soldiers to join and serve the monarch, and they did not rise to the height of patriotism and nationality. In 1371, Edward returned to England due to health problems and officially gave up the title of Duke of Aquitaine in late 1372. His health gradually deteriorated after participating in the Battle of Nala, which accelerated his death. Edward, the Black Prince, died on June 8, 1376 at the age of 45. He did not survive to inherit his father's throne, and his early death had a significant impact on the succession to the throne of England. The early death of the Black Prince was undoubtedly a huge blow to Edward III, who lost a strong and talented heir and military leader who had been cultivated for many years. He died of a stroke a year later on June 21, 1377. These two events are closely linked, marking the end of a powerful era of the English royal family. As the first heir to the throne and the only legitimate son of the Black Prince, Richard II was only 10 years old when he inherited the throne of England in 1377. Since he was still a minor, the governance of the country was actually regent by his uncle John of Gaunt. This led to a series of political turmoil and tragic fratricide. Richard II's mother, Joan, Countess of Kent, did not directly participate in the governance of the country. When Richard II ascended the throne at a young age, the government of England was actually run by a series of regency committees, which were most influenced by Richard's uncles John of Gaunt and Thomas Woodstock. Nevertheless, Joan was not excluded, although there is no evidence that she played an active role in the government. Instead, political decisions at the time were influenced by concerns about John's ambitions, and a regency led by the king's uncles was avoided. As Richard II came of age, Michael de la Pole became a key advisor and became increasingly active in government. Richard II's reign was more associated with his team of noble advisors and his support for the arts and culture than with his mother. Richard II was considered a less warlike king than his father or grandfather, and he tried to end the 100 Years' War from a young age. He was a firm believer in the supremacy of the monarchy, a rebel who was committed to limiting the power of the nobility and relied on a private guard for military protection. Unlike his grandfather, Richard II created a sophisticated atmosphere at court that valued art and culture, and the king was portrayed as a noble figure. Let's introduce Edward III's other sons. Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, is the second son of Edward III. He was born in Antwerp in 1338, so he was called Lionel of Antwerp. Although he was the second son, he was 8 years younger than Edward, the Black Prince. Lionel married Elizabeth, the heiress of Ulster, and obtained a lot of territory through her, becoming the Earl of Aquitaine. He served as the governor of Ireland from 1361 to 1366, during which time he issued the famous Kilkenny Edict. He was created the Duke of Clarence in 1362, becoming the first Irish nobleman to receive this title. Lionel also participated in the 100 Years' War and the war against Scotland, but his activities in France were not as famous as his brother Edward, the Black Prince. Lionel's first wife died in 1363. In 1368, he married Violante Visconti, the niece of Bernabo Visconti, the ruler of Milan, but died shortly after the marriage. He was the first of Edward III's sons to die. Philippa of Clarence was his only daughter in his life. At that time, before her were his uncle, the Black Prince, and Edward's son Richard II. Therefore, after Lionel's death, Philippa ranked after Richard II and became the third in line to the throne. Philippa de Rossi later married Edmund Mortimer, the second son of the Duke of York, the fourth son of Edward III. This marriage of relatives gave their descendants a stronger blood inheritance relationship. According to the order of succession in the UK, the Leon family was after the Black Prince Edward's family, which became an important basis for the later York family to claim priority to the throne of England. Lionel's descendants became important contenders for the throne of England through maternal succession and eventually became kings of England. Let us introduce you to another important character, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, 1340 to 1399, the third son of Edward III. He was named John of Gaunt because he was born in Gaunt, and he played an important role in the political and military affairs of England. John was also an active participant in the 100 Years' War. Although he did not achieve the brilliant achievements of his brother, the Black Prince, he had a more important influence in England's domestic and foreign affairs. John actively participated in England's political affairs and became a de facto power broker during the reign of his nephew Richard II. From 1367 to 1374, John served as a commander in the 100 Years' War between England and France due to the Black Prince's health. 1371. Due to his father's old age, John began to preside over the government and continued to play a role in the military. The relationship between John Lancaster and his elder brother Edward the Black Prince was positive from the records of historical materials. During the period when the Black Prince's health declined, John did not become his opponent and coveted the throne. Instead, when his nephew Richard II was young, he assumed many functions of the English government, became one of the most powerful political figures at the time, and actively assisted the young master. During the 100 Years' War, John and the Black Prince were both major military leaders in England, fighting together for the interests of the country. 1386 to 1388. Went to Spain to claim the throne of Castile and Leon, obtained by marrying Constanza of Castile. Although unsuccessful, it showed his military ambition and diplomatic skills. 1389. After returning home, he helped Richard II to quell the dispute with the nobles. This was not only a political achievement, but also reflected his influence in domestic affairs and military affairs. John Lancaster's military and political career showed that he was a balanced ruler, not only a talented military commander, but also a shrewd politician. Compared with his father Edward III, John Lancaster's family and marriage relationships were very complicated. He was married 3 times and had many children. His children basically became important figures and played an important role in the history of England. John's first wife was Blanche Lancaster, and through her he acquired huge wealth and land. Their eldest daughter Philippa later became the Queen of Portugal. The second daughter Elizabeth later became the Duchess of Exeter, and the only son Henry IV later became the King of England, who replaced Richard II. Another major player in the War of the Roses was Edward's fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, 1341 to 1402. Known as Edmund of Langley, he was named Duke of York and the founder of the House of York. Edmund played a relatively minor role in the 100 Years' War and England's internal affairs. He participated in British politics more as a local lord and nobleman. On the death of his godfather, the Earl of Surrey, Edmund inherited lands north of the Trent, mainly in Yorkshire. In 1359, he accompanied his father, Edward III, on an unsuccessful military expedition against France, and was created a Knight of the Order of the Garter in 1361. In 1362, he was created Earl of Cambridge by his father. Edmund took part in several military expeditions against France in the 1370s. In 1369, he joined John Hastings' army with 400 men-at-arms and 400 archers, and took part in campaigns in Brittany and Angoulême. The following year, he first rejoined Hastings' army to relieve the fortress of Belperche, and then accompanied his brother Edward, the Black Prince, in the campaign that led to the siege and sack of Limoges. In 1375, he sailed with the Earl of March to Brest, but after some initial successes, a truce was declared point superscript 1. In 1381, Edmund led an unsuccessful expedition to support John of Gaunt's claim to Castile, joining forces with King Ferdinand of Portugal to attack Castile. But due to the indecisive battle, peace was declared again and Edmund had to lead the dissatisfied army back home. So, Edmund played an ineffective role in the political struggles during Richard II's reign. In the conflict between Richard II and Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, the Duke of York was caught in a dilemma. He was proud of his loyalty to the king, and Edmund was appointed protector of the realm when Richard II went to Ireland in 1394–95 and May 1399 respectively. When Henry Lancaster invaded England in July, Edmund tried to organize resistance, but soon succumbed, realizing that Richard's cause as a king was completely lost. He understood that Richard II, the Duke of York, was not fit to be king. Despite this, he remained loyal to Richard II. As Bolingbroke's power grew, the Duke of York eventually chose to support his nephew, Henry Bolingbroke. This decision by the Duke of York reflected his inner struggle with his belief in loyalty and orthodox rule. The Duke of York is portrayed in historical records as a traditionalist loyal to the crown. He had a deep loyalty to Richard II, and he felt very uneasy even after Richard II was deposed. But he was also a loyal but realistic character, and his loyalty was first to the throne itself, not to individuals. This period of his history is deeply portrayed in Shakespeare's play Richard II, showing his struggle between loyalty and reality. Edmund married Isabella of Castile. Although Edmund's life was relatively dull, his descendants became influential figures in English history. Edmund's son Edward died at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, and the title was inherited by Edward's nephew Richard. Richard became a major participant in the subsequent War of the Roses and the leader of the House of York. His descendants include the future kings Edward IV and Richard III. The title of Duke of York is usually given to the second son of the British monarch. Historically, this title has been granted and revoked many times. For example, the first grant was to Edmund of Langley in 1384, and the most recent grant was to Prince Andrew in 1986. Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, 1355–1397, was the youngest son of Edward III. He was named after being born in Woodstock and was the fifth son of Edward III. Thomas was very active in the political affairs of England. He was one of the leaders of the aristocratic faction in British politics. He later played an important role in opposing the autocratic rule of Richard II. When Richard II was young, Thomas was ambitious and attempted to be regent. He was named Duke of Gloucester in 1385. Thomas's talents, historical records show that he did have considerable political and military talents. He had commanded military campaigns in northern France and played a role in the conflict following the War of the Breton Succession. However, his ambition and opposition to Richard II ultimately led to his tragic end. Thomas's ambition to be a regent was mainly due to his desire for power and his dissatisfaction with the young king Richard II. As the son of King Edward III of England, Thomas had a high political status. When Richard II ascended the throne, Thomas was only 22 years old and young and vigorous. He believed that he had the ability and right to manage state affairs. Thomas was a victim of the political struggle in Britain. In 1387, at the age of 32, he united with other nobles against the king's favorites and successfully weakened the king's power. As Richard matured and his revenge actions gradually escalated, he was arrested and imprisoned by Richard II in 1397 and died in prison shortly afterwards. The specific cause of his death is controversial. His titles, such as the Duke of Gloucester, were deprived, and his son Humphrey only inherited the title of Earl of Buckingham. Thomas's death marked the return of Richard II to power, but it also led to the insecurity of the aristocracy, paving the way for the rise of the Lancaster family. Dear viewers, this is the content of our historical exploration in this issue. In the next issue, we will reveal the story of the War of the Roses for you, with more excitement and more legends. I am your time travel navigator, Lawrence. By learning from people, we can understand gains and losses. By learning from history, we can understand the rise and fall. Let us understand the distant past and foresee a bright future. Thank you for watching and accompanying us. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell to get more exciting content about history. See you next time.